Millions of Americans are affected by mental health conditions every year, and mental health problems don't only affect adults. In fact, 3 out of 4 people with mental health problems show signs before they are 24 years old. That's why on this month's episode of The Buzz, we're going to talk about mental health openly and honestly. Stay tuned to find out more. Welcome to this month's episode of The Buzz. I'm your host, Dion Spires. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Risdon Slate, who teaches criminology at Florida Southern College. He's here to share his story and personal experiences with mental health. How are you doing today, Dr. Slate?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you all focusing on this issue. I think it's extremely important.
Absolutely, and I think it's definitely important amongst college students. I think college students, a lot of them may struggle with mental illness and either not realize it or try to push it away because of the stigma that surrounds it. So I'm very excited to have you here to talk about your experiences with it and kind of open that door for conversation.
Thank you.
Before we dive into that, I do want to let the viewers know a little bit about you. So you're a criminology professor at Florida Southern College, and you are very credible on this mental illness topic. I want them to know that it's not just from your personal experiences. You've done research on it, you kind of specialize in it in some way, and you've even been on committees and done presentations for it, that sort of thing. So give me some background on you. How did you start in criminology, and just talk about your background for me.
Sure. I have off and on over the years, we kind of rotate chair positions. I have been chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Florida Southern. And recently did my last 3-year stint as chair. And so now I'm back just to a full tenured professor position at Florida Southern. And, I teach kind of a variety of courses, and over the years I've taught, Introduction to Criminal Justice. I've taught Criminology, that's basically theories of crime, what causes crime. I've taught judicial processes. I've taught corrections. Even I've developed a new course in the past few years. It's called Criminalisation of Mental Illness, because I think anybody who's going to work in the criminal justice system needs to have exposure to mental illness, because they're likely going to encounter it. So if they don't have someone, a loved one or a friend who has a mental illness, they're probably going to encounter people on the streets who do. And they need to be able to take a different tact in terms of how to deal with situations when someone who is mentally ill in crisis. And I've done a lot of training with police officers, correctional officers, and even judges and probation officers on recognizing signs and symptoms of mental illness and getting people linked to treatment in the community. And my passion is really focusing on this interface of the mental health and criminal justice systems, and also back to my time at the prison, the stress levels of criminal justice practitioners, because they have extremely difficult jobs to do, and their stress levels can be very high, and this often can have bad repercussions for them down the road if they don't get the stress under control in some shape, form, or fashion.
Absolutely. So now that you are at Florida Southern, you're teaching criminology, and I understand that probably based somewhat off of your experience with mental illness, you kind of interweave those here and there in your criminology studies. So tell me about that.
Sure. I'm originally from North Carolina, and you may detect some Southern accent, but I seem to lose it depending on where I am. But if I go back to North Carolina and spend much time around my mom and the people there, I get my Southern accent back. Right. And so I started out there long ago, and I wanted to be a North Carolina state trooper. really for all the wrong reasons. They have beautiful uniforms and beautiful cars. So I decided, well, okay, I want to do that, but I'm going to go to college first so I can advance through the ranks of the Highway Patrol. And so I get to my senior year of college, and I find out that you had to have no worse than 20/70 uncorrected vision to work for the North Carolina Highway Patrol. And this is before LASIK surgery. So I couldn't work for the North Carolina Highway Patrol. There goes a nice car, a nice uniform. And so I was basically forced to go to graduate school. So I did, went to the University of South Carolina, and I got a master's degree in criminal justice. And first job out of the ivory tower, so to speak, was in a medium maximum death row prison in Columbia, South Carolina. And within the first year there, I was working as administrative assistant to the warden, and basically dealt with all the inmates that the warden didn't want to talk to, so I handled it. And within the first year, we had the first execution in the state of South Carolina in over 20 years. Now, I wasn't actually in the chamber when they executed the inmate, but I saw the toll that it took on the people who carried it out. Extremely stressful. And as such, I started myself having trouble sleeping, and my appetite was shot, and I went to a family practitioner and explained the situation. And he essentially said, I think you're having a situational depression here, and he put me on an antidepressant. And so I said, well, I don't want to get addicted to some drug. And I said, can I stop taking it once the symptoms go away? And he said, yeah, well, when the symptoms go away, you can stop taking it. So lo and behold, after a few months, the symptoms do go away. I stopped taking it. We had a second execution. We made it through that. And then I was ultimately hired as a United States probation officer. The symptoms come back. And so I go back to the family physician, and he puts me back on that medication.
So I'm going to go ahead and throw to our break, since we've kind of set them up to know who you are, the viewers. And then when we come back, we'll dive into your story more and specifically what your experience is with it.
Definitely.
So we'll take a quick break. Stay tuned for some more conversation with Risdon Slate when we come back.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
And we've been moving through that. We are now finished with phase 4, and we're ready shortly.
Jenny, they're going to be doing a road improvement over in front of Bev's place.
Well, you better give her a call because she's always whining about being the last to know.
Built some new sidewalks out there who were desperately needed. Drainage has been accomplished. Lake Blue.
Dad.
Hey, babe, you see that thing?
There's a million things in this world, Dad. What thing?
The thing about the government show, the commissioners talk about road improvements in your area next couple weeks.
Where?
It's PGTV.
What?
It's PGTV.
You know I don't have cable, Dad.
Well, you could also catch it on the interweb. Yeah, the interweb. Watch it on it. It should be on that.
Interweb? Okay, Dad. I'll look it up. Bye. This is going to be great for Tony's business.
Hey, Bev, what's up?
Hey, Tony. I'm watching this show about a road improvement that's going to happen right in front of your shop.
Really? What show is it?
It's a show on PGTV.
Cool, but I don't have my laptop.
It works on your mobile. I'll text you the link.
Seriously? Government TV on my phone?
We've made major strides up. That's something we're still working on. What does this project mean?
PGTV, bringing you county news and information anywhere at any time.
Polk County is a diverse community. 23% of its residents are under the age of 18, while almost 20% are over the age of 65. 37% of Polk County's residents are either African American or Hispanic, Latino. 1 in 5 residents speak a language other than English at home. Approximately 80% of those speak Spanish. 1 in 7 residents live in multi-family dwelling units. Poverty continues to be a challenge for the families and individuals of Polk County. Nearly 1 in 5 residents live below the poverty level. Diverse community means diverse travel needs. The Polk TPO works to ensure that transportation projects and services are available for everyone. It does not tolerate discrimination in any form in its programs, services, or activities. To learn more about the TPO's non-discrimination plan and limited English proficiency plan, visit www.polktpo.com.
Maybe he's really focused.
Hey, Michael. Michael. Maybe he likes spinning the wheels.
Maybe he just loves trucks.
Maybe he's just being a boy.
Preoccupation with objects is one early sign of autism. Learn the others today. The sooner it's diagnosed, the better.
Welcome back to the show. In case you're just tuning in, I'm joined in the studio today by Risdon Slate, a professor in criminology at Florida Southern College. Thank you again for being here with me, Dr. Slate.
Certainly.
Before the break, we let the audience get to know you a little bit. Now I want to dive back into your story because you have a personal story with mental illness and your experience with it that I think is really important for the viewers to see. You were talking about how the physician initially said, this is a situational depression, put you on the medication for it, symptoms went away, you got off of it, they came back. And then he put you back on the same medication, is that right?
Correct.
And then is this kind of where it started to develop, where they realized it's a mental illness, not a temporary thing? Is that?
Yeah, and it took a pretty major crisis to figure that out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I'm a federal probation officer. I was in my first 6 months as a federal probation officer. I had interned at the federal probation office while I was in graduate school at University of South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So I was familiar with the job and what they did. So as a result, when they hired me, they went ahead and gave me a caseload, and I started working on pre-sentence investigations. The symptoms come back, so I go back on the medication, and it was on a Friday night before I was supposed to go for federal probation officer training in Miami from Columbia, South Carolina. and already having a caseload. I was out, it's about 7:30 on a Friday night. I was out doing supervision, and I went to a service station where I knew it had come across my desk earlier in the week that a person under my supervision had been arrested. And the first thing you're supposed to do if you've been arrested is you're supposed to tell your probation officer. Well, he didn't bother to do that. So I went to the service station, talked to him for about 5 minutes, gave him every opportunity to tell me what had happened. He doesn't do it, so I finally confronted him about it. And I said, Sydney, I know you got arrested earlier in the week. I mean, why didn't you tell me? And so he became irate, and he basically looked at me, and he said, look, that guy owed me money. He was on my property. He said, so I spit in his face. And he said it was, I shouldn't have been arrested. And I'm like, well, I'm not here to debate whether the arrest was legitimate or not. I just want to know why you didn't tell me. And so then at that point, he gets in my face and he's pointing his finger and he says, get off of my property. You have no right to be here. And so, I'm like, well, he knows I'm his federal probation officer, but I reached in my vest here, my jacket, and I pulled out my badge just to remind him who I was, even though he knew who I was. And at that point, he says, get off my property, I'm going in, I'm going to call the police. And so I'm like, well, by all means, call the police. I have every right to be here, And so as he turned around to go into the service station, I got this eerie feeling. I'm like, is he going to call the police, or is he going to get a gun and come out here, and shoot me? So I left my nice federal car and I went across the street to a home, a residence, and a couple, and they had a little baby, and called a federal probation officer, a buddy of mine. And we, in turn, called the police. And within about 10 minutes, we all meet back up over at Sydney's service station. And the only thing that the police asked me was, they said, did you at any time unsnap your holster containing your .38 revolver? And I said, no, I didn't, because I hadn't. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, you're free to go. And so I don't know what happened to Sydney after that, but I know what happened to me. Working in the prison, you document everything that happens. So I began preparing a report to document what had happened between Sydney and myself. And I commenced drinking excessively, and drank till basically I passed out, again under a lot of stress. So I get up the next day, similar behavior, and finally on Sunday I'm supposed to go to federal probation officer training in Miami, and I drop the report off at my supervisor's office at the federal courthouse, and my wife, she goes with me. And to make a long story short, what happens is we get to Miami, and I am starting to believe that I'm on the set of Miami Vice. If you remember Don Johnson, Sonny Crockett, Tubbs, the whole 9 yards, maybe it's beyond your age, but anyway, I believe I'm on the set of Miami Vice, and I began interacting with people as if they're on the set of Miami Vice too, with me. And so I encounter someone at a bar down there who reminds me of my father, and we get into a discussion, and my father and I I'd never lived with him. We didn't get along that well, and so we ended up in an argument, this guy. And I knew he wasn't my father, but I believed that he was playing the role of my father on this film set. So the police are called. They asked me to leave, because I tell them I'm not staying in the hotel. I'm Mr. Incognito here. And they escort him off the premises. Well, I left, but then I came back because where am I going, And so they picked me up at that point. And I ended up being taken by the police, ultimately, to Jackson Memorial Hospital. And I was hospitalized, put in 4-point restraints. And You know, when I worked at the prison, I used to be in charge of the 4-point restraint policy and updating policies. And I guess if you're going to be, you know, writing policies about 4-point restraints, you ought to be placed in them. So I found myself in 4-point restraints. And then a doctor sees me. They find my wife somehow in the hotel. They bring her there. And I literally believe that there were, on the headboard behind me was all of these, it looked like spiders crawling down the headboard towards me. It's where chips of paint were broken off. And so I just started screaming, I hate spiders. And my wife, they had found, she's sitting outside the seclusion room and she hears the screams. And she's 24 years old. I'm 26 at the time. And so anyway, they agreed to release me if I will go back to Columbia, South Carolina and be hospitalized. So I never made it to federal probation officer training. And I come back to Columbia, and within a 2-week span of time, I find out from first a psychiatrist, Dr. Roger Deal. He told me, he said, well, he said, I got some good news and some bad news. And I said, well, you know, ever the pessimist, what's the bad news? He said, the bad news is, he said, you're bipolar. He said, the good news is you got to have above average intelligence to be bipolar. And I'm like, well, that's great. I said, but you know, what does this mean for my life? What is going to happen here? And, you know, that's, I think, a very important question that people in positions of authority may find themselves asked by somebody in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a break of some sort. And that's what I try to emphasize when I train police officers or correctional officers, judges, whomever it may be, that, you know, I remember what Roger Deal said to me. He said, well, he said, you know what? He said, young man, he said, the way I get my jollies, the way I get my kicks is by taking people like you and putting you back together again so you can go forth and be successful. And he said, and I believed him, you know. Now, if he told me I couldn't, it might have made me mad, and I would show him that I could, perhaps, I don't know. But I believed what he said to me. And he said, yeah, you can move forth and be successful. He said, but I don't know about being a federal probation officer. He said, but who the hell wants to be a federal probation officer anyway? You know? But I did. I had put all my marbles in that bucket to be a federal probation officer. And so a week later, my fine colleague supervisor at federal probation came in and said, adios, we want you to resign for medical reasons. So there goes a nice federal job, the bennies, et cetera. Right. 1 week after that, my 24-year-old wife came in and said, I backed up a U-Haul, I'm leaving you. Basically at that point, you know, I had to do some soul searching, and I had to decide if I wanted to stay around for any more of life's fun. And, you know, I did, and I'm glad that I did now. But, you know, I went very much deep into myself. My mom still lives in North Carolina, and I went back to my mom's and put myself back together. And, you know, it's good to have a mom at a point like that, or somebody that loves you, you know. And so I basically went up there and paced the floors in my mom's little textile mill village house, and my grandmother was there. And read a lot of scripture, you know, and just tried to figure out, you know, what am I going to do with my life? Within 3 months, I got a job teaching part-time at a community college. I was fortunate in that I had a master's degree. I already had a master's, so I could teach. And I got that job within the 3 months, and then after teaching there for about a year, I started applying to PhD programs. And applied to 3, got accepted at all 3, Florida State, Michigan State, and Claremont Graduate School in Claremont, California. and Claremont gave me a full ride, full fellowship, stipend for living expenses, and so I went to Claremont to pursue my PhD. And none of the applications for the PhD programs asked if I was mentally ill. I guess they figured, there's probably something wrong with you if you're going to get a PhD, right? So in any event, I go to Claremont, but all the while, I'm seeing doctors, getting medication. I'm telling no one other than significant others that I have a mental illness, because I'm ashamed. Right. I'm embarrassed of having a mental illness. And that's where the stigma comes in.
Absolutely. And you said a lot of interesting things in there that I think are important. One, you mentioned the symptoms. You mentioned you started drinking more, you had a loss of appetite or a change in appetite, sleeping problems, that sort of thing. I was looking at some research on things to be aware of from, I believe it was the National Association of Mental Illness. Those all came up. You mentioned you went to your mom to put yourself back together, and how important it is to have someone who loves you and cares for you in a time like that. That's one of the biggest things that they said. So
definitely. You
did all of the right things, I believe. Obviously, you're a success story here to talk about it, and you didn't give into it. So elaborate for me a little bit on what ran through your head when you were told you have bipolar disorder. How do you react to that? How do you come to terms with that? What was your personal experience with that?
When I was hit with mental illness, it was something that I had never even thought about having to grapple with or deal with. And so that's when I went pretty introspective into myself, trying to figure out, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? And I kind of balled it up and didn't share it with anybody. And David Satcher, former U.S. Surgeon General, has said that the number one inhibitor for people with mental illnesses receiving treatment is stigma, because they're ashamed, they're embarrassed. So I was. And that embarrassment and that shame ultimately cost me and had me have a second manic episode. And so that's when I decided to come out of the closet about having a mental illness. But it took that second instance for me to do that. I believe that this was the Supreme Being's way of perhaps shaking me and saying, you got to come out of this stigma deal, and you got to face it head on, because it's bigger than you are. You've got to do this to try to help other people so that they can face what they're dealing with.
Now, I want to talk about a little bit of the stigma specifically for a moment. What are some of the misconceptions and the stigmas from someone who was scared and ashamed to come out and say, I have a mental illness? What are some of the things that someone is faced with when they are in that situation?
There are so many people with mental illness who are getting up every day, they're going to work, they're functioning, they're doing fine, but you hear about, some violent episode took place somewhere, and we hear this focus on violence. Most people with mental illness are not violent. The vast majority are not violent. In fact, they're more likely to be a victim of crime than to perpetrate a crime. And so I think that we need more positive efforts on the part of the media to show some of those success stories and to demonstrate that recovery is possible out there. And I've been involved with John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, and they've had a deal where they bring in reporters from around the country, and they basically focus on, let's look at the positive sides of people who have mental illness, and let's get away from all of this negativity. If somebody is portrayed as mentally ill in a soap opera, they're usually violent. Oftentimes a murderer when they're portrayed there. Primetime dramas, when you see somebody who has a mental illness, it's oftentimes the same thing. It's a negative light. Newspapers, when you read about somebody who's mentally ill in a newspaper, what are you seeing? You're seeing negativity. You're seeing that they've been involved in some violent incident, but you don't see all the people that day who did what they were supposed to do
Right.
and didn't cause any problems.
Mhm.
So I think that helps to perpetuate the stigma of mental illness.
Yeah.
And we need to debunk that.
Definitely. And I want to share a couple of statistics here that I came across, just so that the viewers are aware. 20% of youth aged 13 to 18 have a mental health condition. 11% has a mood disorder, 10% of youth has a behavior or conduct disorder, and 8% of youth has an anxiety disorder. So there's an array of different types of disorders that they can have, and they're not alone if they do find themselves with one.
Right.
That 20% that's only in ages 13 to 18. So there's a lot of people out there who are dealing with them, and there is a support system, and they don't have to feel alone. So I just think that that's important to point out, and that's from the National Alliance of Mental Illness.
And when I did my recovery, I unfortunately did not rely on the National Alliance of Mental Illness because I was in the closet and I was ashamed.
Right.
But they did help me ultimately to come out of the closet, and I actually served on the national board for the National Alliance of Mental Illness. Great organization. Great organization. And I would encourage anybody, family member, consumer of mental health services, advocate, to align themselves with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're at Arlington, Virginia, and they do a great job in terms of trying to lobby the legislature regarding changes in legislation and having a positive impact on mental illness.
Now, for someone who's watching this program and maybe they are struggling with a mental illness, specifically in the college age demographic, because that's who we kind of cater to, if they're struggling with it, if they're maybe not out about it yet, can you talk about your adjustment and how you did come to terms with it? And once you were out there about it, what did you do to kind of make it through that? Any kind of changes in your personality or relationships or anything like that? How do you work through it?
I went for 8 years, right, after the Miami incident, and I go back to school. I get a PhD, right? So I'm bipolar. I'm telling nobody in my classes I'm bipolar. They don't know it unless they found out afterwards. And then I go to Maine. I teach for 4 years in Maine. And then I came to Florida Southern in 1993. Got here. Like I said, I've been seeing doctors all along, getting meds, telling no one other than significant others that I was mentally ill. And I came here and looked up a doctor in the yellow pages and looked at a hospital referral service and found my doctor. Met with the doctor about 4 times, psychiatrist. NYU, medical degree. Ooh, you think that's, because you think that person know what they're doing, right? Met with him about 4 times. He said, you know what? I think he had a brief reactive psychosis to a stressful event that happened 4 years ago. And he said, I don't think you're mentally ill. I'm like, okay, so you're telling me I'm not mentally ill, I don't have to have blood work. So, took me off the meds. Within 2 months, with my new wife, I'm at a football game in Columbia, South Carolina. Literally believe that I can make the South Carolina Gamecock football players run over the Georgia Bulldogs, and that South Carolina will beat the Bulldogs. And this is before the arrival of Lou Holtz or Steve Spurrier. Doesn't happen. I get mad about third quarter. My wife and I leave. Long story short, the police are called to a condo where I'm staying. And when they come, my wife is there saying, here's the vial of medication my husband should be on. He's a former federal probation officer in this town. He's former administrative assistant to the warden. He's got a PhD in criminal justice. He's a college professor. Please help him. Their help for me was they took me directly to jail. They did not bother telling anybody at booking that I was showing signs and symptoms of mental illness. And within an hour in a holding cell, I was assaulted and battered by another inmate. Ron Hudson, a federal probation officer, came down to that jail under no authority whatsoever. He flashed his badge. He said, you've got Risdon Slate in here. He's coming with me. And they let me go. I went with him. He got me to an emergency room. I was hospitalized and came back to Florida Southern. And what I've done since then is I decided that if that could happen to me, with my background and my experience, it could happen to anybody, and
Absolutely.
it is, and it is. And from that day forth, once I got back on my feet, I decided I am not going to be ashamed of having a mental illness. What I'm ashamed of is the treatment or lack thereof that people with mental illness in our society receive, and we need an infrastructure in place to help people with mental illness get linked to treatment. And we're seeing that some here in Polk County. You've got the Behavioral Health Court with Judge Williams. Sheriff Grady Judd has CIT training on a regular basis for officers. I've heard Sheriff Judd say he doesn't want people with mental illness in his jail. He wants them linked to treatment, because if you link them to treatment, they're not going to recycle back and forth through the jail and be a costly problem for the jail if you can get them linked to treatment. And that half-cent sales tax that we've had here that just got re-voted in, I think it's a great thing to help people because the bottom line is I was fortunate. I was lucky. I had contacts that could help me when I was helpless. But many people don't have that. And so, the message from all this, I think, to students out there, to anyone, is that recovery is indeed possible if you're able to put the pieces of the puzzle together and you get people to help you. So in terms of my personality change was, I'm not going to run from this anymore. I'm going to face it head on. And I must say to you that for the most part, to my knowledge, with one or two exceptions, it has been a very positive experience of facing mental illness head on as opposed to running from it.
And from your stories that you've told me today, what I've gathered is that one of the biggest things, biggest steps to take, I guess, when you're dealing with a mental illness is just first and foremost to find someone to help. Would you say that that's accurate? Just don't try to do it on your own and don't hide away from it?
Right, and you need to have someone that, let's say that there's a possibility you may have a mental illness, you may know you have a mental illness. I think that you need to have someone that you trust and someone that even in a crisis that you will, listen to what they have to say and can help you get access to treatment. And I think that's extremely important. And I think for some people, they don't have that. But NAMI is a great organization, again, to provide support for family, for consumers, and for advocates. Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in just not trying to do it alone, because I've interacted with people who have had mental illnesses in the past and whatnot, and a lot of people do tend to try to do it on their own. And I think a support system with someone you trust, like you said, is absolutely one of the biggest things from my perspective. But I want to ask you specifically to young adults, aside from what we've already talked about, get help, what is some specific advice that you can give to some young adults who may already know that they have a mental illness or are trying to kind of push it away? What do you have to say to them, seeing that you were 26 whenever you were diagnosed with yours?
Well, I think that each individual will have to grapple with when it's appropriate for them to come out, perhaps, about their mental illness. And some people may not be at that point that they're ready to do so. But even if they're not, they still can surround themselves with people who can help get them linked to proper treatment. And some people, it may never be right for them to come out and say that they're mentally ill. So each individual, I think, has to deal with it in their own way. And for me, I mean, it took, basically getting knocked over the head that second time for me to do that. There are those people who say, well, sometimes it's kind of nice to be a little manic, right? But my problem has been with the 2 manic episodes I had, that they were so psychotic, they were so delusional, there's really nothing fun about that, and you feel like a fool afterwards, and so I don't want to be manic, not at all.
Right.
And another problem in all of this, and we see particularly in the criminal justice system, is the co-occurring disorders, where you'll have somebody who has a mental illness, but they're also abusing substances.
Right.
I believe, in retrospect, my father probably was bipolar, but he was never diagnosed as bipolar because he had a drinking problem. And so the problem with that is people will self-medicate with alcohol, which brings them down. You think of alcohol as a stimulant, but it actually brings you down. But I would say that for young people, they need to find that person or those persons they can trust and believe in, and then make a decision on their own whether or not they want to come out. I would say that young people should look for others in society who have similar types of illnesses and see that it's possible to be in recovery.
I want to ask you one more question before we wrap things up.
Sure.
From the other side, you talk a lot about the stigma and how we need to work towards breaking the stigma. Amongst young people, if you come in contact with someone who maybe confides to you that they have a mental illness or something of that nature, how can one respond effectively to help that person? And how can we as a whole kind of work to start breaking that stigma? I know it's going to be a process. It's not going to happen overnight. But what is your view on that?
Well, I would go, again, right back to NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, because they are a great organization where people can safely talk about their illness amongst other consumers and amongst family members. And there's the website for NAMI is NAMI.org, NAMI.org. And they have a wealth of information on their website, which can provide, various avenues for people to pursue. And I would say, get involved. And that's really, where I first came out after that second episode was I came out to a guy by the name of Carl Reed. He was the president of NAMI Polk County, and I got in touch with Mr. Reed, and it was, all of a sudden it was this welcoming. I was welcomed. Nobody was like, oh, you get mental illness, run away.
Right.
And I'll tell you another example is Judge Ginger Lerner Wren is the first mental health court judge in the United States. She's in Broward County. And I remember I went down there to do some research because I published an article about mental health courts, and I interviewed her, and never will forget. I told her my story, similar to what I've told you today, and she looked at me and she said, Risdon, that's not your fault. It's not your fault. I mean, I had been beating myself up, blaming myself for something that happened that cost me my marriage, that cost me my job. But she looked me straight in the eye and she said, it's not your fault. And that's, really, really lifted my spirits, and it was heartening to hear from an authority figure. But she looked at me and she said, it's not your fault. And it kind of gave me like, well, you know what? Maybe I can forgive myself.
And I think that you're doing a great job by sharing your story. I appreciate that you're so open and honest about it, because really awareness is half the battle, just to know that other people are out there and it's not your fault.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. If you're worried that you are having a mental health problem, please know that you're not alone and it is not your fault. Talk to a family member, close friend, or anyone else who you trust about what you're going through. You can also call the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline at 800-950-NAMI. You can watch this episode on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. on PGTV, or find us on the Polk Government YouTube page. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.